Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change its structure and function in response to experience. This concept is not metaphorical, it's a biologically measurable process. It means that your nervous system, including your brain and spinal cord, is malleable. It rewires itself constantly based on what you focus on, what you repeat, and what you expose yourself to. This is the foundational mechanism that underpins your ability to unlock potential and develop what many call unique abilities. At birth, your brain is not a blank slate, but a highly dynamic system prepared to adapt to its environment. Early in life, the brain undergoes what are known as critical periods, during which it is particularly receptive to specific types of learning. Language acquisition, sensory integration, and motor skills are deeply influenced during this stage. But what science has revealed in the last 2 decades is that while these critical periods do close, plasticity doesn't stop. It just becomes more gated, meaning that access to plasticity in adulthood requires specific conditions. One of the most important discoveries in neuroscience is that attention acts as a gate for neuroplasticity. When you deeply focus on something, a cascade of neurochemical signals is released, primarily acetylcholine from the basal forebrain and norepinephrine from the locus coeruleus. These chemicals mark specific synapses connections between neurons as important. Think of this like tagging certain circuits in your brain with a save command. Then, during sleep and rest, particularly during non-REM sleep, these tags are consolidated. A state is limited. If you constantly engage in reactive behaviors like checking your phone compulsively or procrastinating, you're strengthening those neural patterns. On the other hand, if you systematically redirect your focus to intentional, growth-oriented tasks, you begin reinforcing the circuits that support discipline, creativity, and purpose. What's particularly relevant to unique abilities is that everyone's brain has subtle structural and functional differences, what neuroscience calls individual connectomics. Some people have enhanced connectivity in the default mode network, which is associated with introspection and creativity. Others show more robust activation in the frontoparietal network, which is involved in goal setting and executive control. These aren't just academic distinctions, they represent windows into your natural strengths, but those windows only open through directed effort. You discover and amplify your unique abilities by repeatedly challenging your brain in diverse but specific ways. That repeated exposure to challenge and effort paired with curiosity and focus leads to circuit reinforcement in those areas where you're naturally inclined to excel. The speed at which plasticity occurs can be increased or decreased based on internal and external states. For example, novelty and urgency, such as learning a skill under pressure, heighten the plastic state. So do physiological practices like deep breathing, movement, and cold exposure, which shift your nervous system into a heightened alertness state. These elevated states of neurophysiological readiness prepare the brain to encode new information more effectively. It's also essential to understand that plasticity can be both positive and negative. Just as you can build a powerful mindset through consistent effort, you can also train anxiety, procrastination, and self-doubt into your nervous system by repeatedly engaging those patterns. What you do repeatedly becomes what you are neurologically. So the question becomes, what are you training your brain to do? Neuroplasticity is not something that happens once and is done. It's an ongoing daily process governed by what you do with your attention, how you structure your days, and how well you manage stress and recovery. Every moment of deliberate effort is a signal to your brain that this matters, that this circuit is worth strengthening. The human brain operates on biological rhythms that significantly impact cognitive function, energy levels, and capacity for deep focus. One of the most relevant cycles in this context is the ultradian rhythm, a recurrent period that repeats throughout the day, typically every 90 to 120 minutes. Unlike the circadian rhythm, which governs the sleep-wake cycle across a 24-hour period, ultradian rhythms influence fluctuations in alertness, cognitive performance, and attention span throughout the day. Understanding and aligning with these natural cycles is essential if you want to access sustained states of deep focus and unlock higher levels of mental performance. Ultradian cycles are driven by changes in neural and hormonal activity, specifically fluctuations in brainwave patterns, neurotransmitter availability, and autonomic nervous system balance. At the start of a cycle, the brain ramps up alertness, dominated by increased norepinephrine and dopamine activity. These chemicals enhance attention, drive, and goal-oriented thinking. During ultradian rhythm, a recurrent period that repeats throughout the day, typically every 90 to 120 minutes. Unlike the circadian rhythm, which governs the sleep-wake cycle across a 24-hour period, ultradian rhythms influence fluctuations in alertness, cognitive performance, and attention span throughout the day. Understanding and aligning with these natural cycles is essential if you want to access sustained states of deep focus and unlock higher levels of mental performance. Ultradian cycles are driven by changes in neural and hormonal activity, specifically fluctuations in brainwave patterns, neurotransmitter availability, and autonomic nervous system balance. At the start of a cycle, the brain ramps up alertness, dominated by increased norepinephrine and dopamine activity. These chemicals enhance attention, drive, and goal-oriented thinking. During this phase, which can last from 60 to 90 minutes, you are most capable of engaging in complex problem-solving, creative work, and tasks requiring sustained concentration. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning, decision-making, and regulating behavior, is particularly active. This is your cognitive prime time. However, this focus window doesn't last indefinitely. As the ultradian cycle progresses, there's a gradual shift. Brain activity begins to change, and you experience a subtle drop in alertness. Neural fatigue begins to set in, neurotransmitters like acetylcholine and dopamine are depleted, and cortisol levels may begin to rise slightly. At this stage, distraction becomes more likely and errors can increase if the task is demanding. This is the signal that the current peak cycle is closing. The body and brain naturally start pushing you toward a recovery phase of 15 to 30-minute dip where your system is nudging you to rest, recharge, and allow biochemical replenishment. Ignoring this need leads to diminishing returns, mental fog, and burnout over time. Most people never tune into these natural cycles. They brute force their way through the entire day in a constant state of low to moderate distraction, checking emails, switching tasks, or relying on stimulants like caffeine to artificially maintain a state of wakefulness. But when you work against your ultradian rhythms, you're not just wasting energy, you're suppressing your brain's ability to enter deep, high-leverage focus states. Focus is not a trait you either have or don't have. It's a physiological state that can be trained and optimized, but only when aligned with these innate biological cycles. To harness these peak focus windows, the first step is awareness. Pay attention to the periods of the day when you feel most alert, most cognitively agile, and least distracted. For many people, this window occurs within the first 2 hours after waking, following a period of movement and hydration, but before heavy food intake. For others, it may occur in mid-morning or even early afternoon. Individual variability exists based on chronotype, sleep quality, stress levels, and prior mental activity. What's important is that you begin to map your own cycles when your brain is naturally prepared for deep work and when it needs recovery. Once identified, these peak cycles should be treated as high-value real estate. During these times, engage in what cognitive scientists call deep work, the kind of thinking that stretches nervous system and allowing key neurotransmitters like dopamine and acetylcholine to reset. This recovery prepares the brain to re-enter another peak phase with renewed clarity and motivation. Timing your most important tasks to coincide with your peak focus cycles is a strategic advantage in both personal and professional life. The brain does not operate at a constant level of performance throughout the day. Trying to override this reality with willpower alone is inefficient and unsustainable. Instead, the goal is synchronization. When your most cognitively demanding tasks align with your brain's peak neurochemical readiness, output increases, quality improves, and the process itself becomes more enjoyable. This is when effort meets efficiency and your potential begins to scale. Dopamine is a neuromodulator, not just a pleasure chemical as it's commonly labeled. It plays a central role in motivation, drive, goal-directed behavior, and the pursuit of rewards. It operates less like a reward in itself and more like the chemical anticipation of reward. In other words, dopamine rises when you pursue something meaningful or novel, not necessarily when you achieve it. This mechanism is deeply rooted in evolution, designed to keep organisms moving toward resources, learning opportunities, and survival-relevant outcomes. But in the modern environment where dopamine-triggering stimuli are everywhere and always available, this powerful system is often hijacked. Developing dopamine discipline means learning how to manage the system in a way that preserves your ability to stay focused, motivated, and purpose-driven over the long term. And feelings of meaninglessness. Dopamine discipline is the practice of maintaining a healthy relationship with this system. It's about spacing out your dopamine-inducing activities so that the system can reset, maintaining a high baseline of motivation. One of the most effective ways to train this discipline is to intentionally delay gratification. When you work hard toward a goal without immediately rewarding yourself, when you push through the discomfort of training, studying, building, or solving, you teach your nervous system to associate effort itself with dopamine release. This rewires the brain to find satisfaction not just in the outcome, but in the process. This is a neurobiological shift. It involves increased activity in the prefrontal cortex and the striatum, particularly in circuits that modulate self-regulation and long-term planning. A major trap in modern life is the constant availability of dopamine spikes with zero effort. Every notification, like a new piece of content, acts as a miniature dopamine hit. Over time, this erodes your capacity to engage in activities that require sustained attention and delayed rewards. You start to expect stimulation without cost. Dopamine discipline means creating intentional friction in your habits. It means choosing activities where effort precedes reward, where challenge is part of the structure, and where novelty doesn't dominate. That might look like taking cold showers, doing deep work before checking your phone, or going on walks without digital input. These practices aren't about self-denial for its own sake. They're about preserving the brain's sensitivity to natural sources of dopamine that align with growth and fulfillment. The context in which dopamine is released matters deeply. If you give yourself a reward every time you complete a small task, the brain starts associating the task with the reward instead of the internal satisfaction of effort. This weakens intrinsic motivation. But if you learn to anchor dopamine to the process, not the outcome, the brain becomes more resilient. Studies in both animals and humans show that when dopamine is tied to effort and delayed reinforcement, individuals are more persistent, more focused, and less likely to give up under stress. This is not abstract motivation theory. It's a direct result of how the midbrain, particularly the ventral tegmental area, VTA, communicates with areas like the nucleus accumbens and prefrontal cortex. These connections determine your capacity to initiate, sustain, and enjoy effortful action. One of the challenges of dopamine discipline is that the effects are not immediately obvious. You don't feel a surge of pleasure when you choose to skip a dopamine-rich habit. In fact, it may initially feel like a loss, but underneath that discomfort, neurochemical recalibration is taking place. The brain is resetting its baseline. Over time, your ability to focus improves. You find yourself more engaged in tasks that once felt boring. Small wins start to feel meaningful again. Novelty no longer becomes a requirement for interest. What's happening is that you are reclaiming your dopaminergic system. You're taking it out of the hands of passive stimulus and putting it back under conscious regulation. Discipline around dopamine also includes learning how to recover it after depletion. Sleep, nutrition, sunlight, physical movement, and meaningful social interaction are all part of this recovery process. These behaviors restore dopamine reserves naturally and sustainably. They recalibrate your baseline so that you're not operating from a place of chronic deficit. Stimulants and synthetic inputs may offer short-term boosts, but they come at a long-term cost. The brain adapts to the source of dopamine. If it's always external, you train yourself to become dependent on external conditions. But when dopamine comes from within, from vision, discipline, and aligned action, you gain independence from circumstances. Stress is not inherently bad. In fact, it is one of the most potent triggers for neuroplasticity, growth, and performance adaptation available to the human system. The key distinction lies in the type, intensity, and context of the stressor. Chronic, unpredictable stress with no clear outlet or meaning is damaging both psychologically and physiologically. But acute, intentional stress, what can be called strategic stress, has the opposite effect. It primes the nervous system for adaptation, boosts cognitive and emotional resilience, and teaches the brain how to operate more effectively under pressure. Learning how to expose yourself to the right kinds of stress at the right intensity with adequate recovery is one of the most powerful tools for unlocking potential. Strategic stress activates the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, also known as the fight or flight system. When this system is activated, heart rate increases, breathing accelerates, and attention narrows. The brain shifts into a focused, alert state. The amygdala becomes more active, scanning for threat or significance, and the prefrontal cortex becomes tasked with executive control over the response. In this state, the release of norepinephrine and epinephrine heightens awareness, while cortisol supports energy mobilization and memory encoding. If the stressor is framed as a challenge rather than a threat, the result is an increase in performance and learning capacity. One of the most studied and replicable forms of strategic stress is cold exposure. When you immerse yourself in cold water or expose yourself to cold air, the body immediately interprets this as a survival-relevant stressor. Skin temperature drops, norepinephrine levels spike, and the brain enters a state of heightened vigilance. But unlike chronic psychological stress, this is controllable, time-limited, and self-initiated. The key to making it beneficial lies in staying calm while in the stressor. If you can maintain control of your breathing, posture, and internal narrative during the stress, you teach your nervous system that intensity does not always require panic. This is where mental resilience is built, not by avoiding stress, but by entering it willingly and regulating your response from within. The same principle applies to other domains. Public speaking, for instance, is one of the most universally feared experiences, not because it's dangerous, but because it triggers deep social evaluation circuits in the brain. Voluntarily putting yourself in situations where you have to speak in front of others, pitch an idea, or lead a discussion causes the release of adrenaline, activates the anterior cingulate cortex, which processes error detection and emotional tone, and forces the brain to regulate under pressure. Repeated exposure to these kinds of challenges creates a stronger tolerance for ambiguity and a higher capacity to think clearly when stakes feel high. Physical exertion also falls into the category of strategic stress. High-intensity exercise, especially in unfamiliar movements or under time pressure, pushes the body and brain beyond their current limits. It triggers inflammation, metabolic shifts, and neurological signaling that lead to adaptation, both in muscle and in mental toughness. The stress of the workout, when paired with proper recovery, creates a stronger organism. But beyond the physical adaptations, there's also a shift in identity. You start to see yourself as someone who voluntarily steps into hard things. This shift, while subtle, has deep implications for self-confidence and the willingness to take on difficult goals outside of the gym or training environment. Sleep deprivation, information overload, conflict resolution, these are also sources of stress that, when approached strategically, can become growth opportunities. The key difference is the presence of intention. When you choose the stressor, prepare for it, and create a recovery plan, your brain encodes the experience differently. It sees the stress not as a threat to survival, but as a forge for capability. This triggers changes in synaptic plasticity, increases in brain-derived neurotrophic factor BENF, and adaptations in emotion regulation circuits. The result is not just tolerance for stress, but a growing appetite for meaningful challenge. Importantly, the window of tolerance can be trained. This term, originating from trauma research, refers to the range of arousal states within which you can think clearly, make decisions, and take action. Strategic stress expands this window. By repeatedly engaging with discomfort while maintaining conscious awareness, you stretch the nervous system's capacity. You build what psychologists call stress inoculation, the ability to stay functional in high-pressure environments because your system has experienced similar arousal levels before and knows how to regulate them. Strategic stress does not mean pushing yourself to the edge at all times. In fact, without cycles of downregulation and recovery through sleep, breathwork, nature exposure, social connection, and low stimulus rest, the benefits of stress exposure diminish. The nervous system needs oscillation between high and low arousal in order to maintain adaptability. Just like a muscle, resilience grows through stress and rest. The goal isn't to eliminate stress, but to develop fluency in it, to be able to move through it skillfully without being overwhelmed or hijacked by it. Every brain is wired differently. While there are universal patterns of cognition, perception, and learning that apply across the human species, the unique architecture of your neural circuits determines how you think, solve problems, and create meaning. Mapping your unique cognitive strengths begins with understanding that individuality is not just a personality trait, it is a biological reality. The folds of the cortex, the density of synaptic connections, the strength of networks between brain regions, and the balance of neurotransmitters vary from person to person. These variations form the basis of cognitive diversity. Rather than trying to fit into a predefined model of intelligence or productivity, unlocking your potential requires you to identify and train the areas where your brain is naturally optimized to perform. Cognitive strengths emerge from patterns of brain activity that are reinforced over time. Some of this reinforcement is driven by genetic predispositions, but much of it comes from repeated experience, attention, and feedback. If you were frequently praised for visual creativity as a child, your brain likely adapted by strengthening networks involved in spatial reasoning, visual memory, and image manipulation. If you spent years solving puzzles, writing stories, or engaging in logical debates, your neural architecture adapted accordingly. Over time, these patterns solidify into reliable pathways of high performance, what we refer to as strengths. However, many people never stop to examine what those patterns actually are. They continue to operate on assumptions about what they should be good at, rather than exploring the areas where their attention flows most effortlessly, their intuition is most accurate, and their learning is fastest. One of the most direct ways to map your cognitive strengths is to analyze the types of problems you gravitate toward and the environments in which you perform best. Some individuals thrive in complexity. They can hold multiple variables in working memory, see patterns in chaos, and synthesize diverse inputs into a coherent whole. Others excel in precision. They focus deeply on one variable at a time, refine systems, and drive incremental improvement through rigorous attention to detail. These are not just personality types. They are neurocognitive orientations that reflect underlying circuitry. Functional MRI studies show that individuals who are high in systems thinking tend to exhibit greater connectivity between the default mode network and the executive control network. Those who thrive in procedural tasks often display heightened activation in the basal ganglia and sensor-motor integration areas. By reflecting on what kinds of thinking feel energizing, what types of challenges you lose track of time in, and where you repeatedly get positive outcomes with less perceived effort, you begin to reverse engineer your brain's preferred pathways. Another layer to cognitive strength mapping involves identifying your sensory and perceptual biases. Some people have heightened auditory processing. They pick up on tone, rhythm, and voice subtleties almost instantly. Others are visually dominant, absorbing spatial layouts, visual cues, and symbolic imagery faster than linguistic input. Kinesthetic learners experience cognition through movement. They understand best when they can engage physically with their environment or translate concepts into motor patterns. These sensory processing differences are not peripheral to cognition. They shape the very way information is taken in, processed, and stored. Understanding your dominant perceptual channels allows you to structure your environment and learning processes in a way that amplifies strength and reduces unnecessary cognitive load. Emotional cognition is another critical domain often overlooked in strength mapping. Some individuals possess acute interoceptive awareness. They are finely tuned to their internal states and can use that information to guide behavior, decision-making, and social interaction. Others have strong empathic resonance. They intuitively grasp what others are feeling and can respond with accuracy and nuance. These are not just social skills, they are cognitive strengths rooted in the anterior insula, the medial prefrontal cortex, and the mirror neuron system. Recognizing whether your cognitive edge lies in emotional pattern recognition, internal signal tracking, or empathic reasoning provides you with tools to make better decisions, build deeper relationships, and navigate complex interpersonal dynamics with clarity and confidence. There is also a time-based element to cognitive strength. Some people have fast processing brains. They think in quick, sharp bursts and excel in high-stakes environments where rapid decision-making is required. Others operate on a slower, more reflective tempo. Their cognition is depth-oriented rather than speed-oriented. They may take longer to arrive at an insight, but when they do, it is often more integrated, more original, and more enduring. Neither is superior. The problem arises when fast processors are forced into slow systems or when slow processors are rushed into premature conclusions. Understanding your cognitive tempo allows you to optimize task structure, team dynamics, and long-term goals in a way that honors your natural rhythm. Cognitive strengths are not static. They can evolve with exposure, training, and conscious practice. But evolution starts with awareness. When you understand your brain's natural patterns, what it pays attention to, how it solves problems, where it finds clarity, you begin to orient your life around alignment rather than friction. You build your workflow, relationships, learning practices, and even your self-concept on the foundation of neurological truth rather than societal expectation. This internal mapping becomes a compass, pointing you toward the kind of effort that produces exponential growth instead of diminishing returns. Human performance is driven by feedback loops. In every system from biology to business, feedback acts as a regulator, highlighting what's working, revealing what's not, and directing adaptive change. The brain as a learning organ is no different. It depends on constant feedback from the internal and external environment to refine behaviors, update models of the world, and guide decision-making. Without feedback, the nervous system defaults to assumptions, habits, and fixed pathways. With feedback, it evolves. Creating a feedback-rich environment means deliberately constructing the kind of conditions where real-time, meaningful, and accurate information flows back into your system so that improvement is not only possible but inevitable. At the neurological level, feedback enhances the learning process through mechanisms like prediction error and reinforcement signaling. Prediction error occurs when the brain expects one outcome but experiences another. That gap generates a signal, often driven by dopamine and other modulators, that updates the brain's internal model and strengthens or weakens specific neural pathways. This is how we learn to hit a target, pronounce a word correctly, or regulate emotional responses. But for this to happen consistently, the environment must allow the brain to see and register the gap between intended and actual performance. That's where most people fail, not because they lack ability, but because their environment is not giving them clear, rapid, and constructive feedback. A feedback-rich environment is one where results both good and bad are visible, traceable, and specific. Ambiguous outcomes create ambiguity in the nervous system. When you don't know whether what you did worked or failed, or why, your brain struggles to adjust behavior effectively. Specificity is what makes feedback neurologically potent. For instance, telling someone they need to do better offers no traction. Telling them they missed a deadline because they underestimated the prep time by 30% provides a clear signal to recalibrate. Similarly, praising someone by saying good job offers little value compared to you improved your pacing during the second half of that presentation, which made your message more impactful. The more precise the feedback, the more actionable the learning. For an individual to thrive in a feedback-rich environment, the conditions must also support psychological safety. This is not about comfort, it's about clarity. When people feel they will be punished for missteps, they avoid risk, reduce effort, and limit exposure. But when the environment is structured to reward learning, even from failure, then the brain begins to perceive feedback not as a threat, but as fuel. This is not simply a mindset shift, it's a neurobiological shift. The amygdala, which governs threat detection, reduces its activity in safe learning environments, while the prefrontal cortex takes greater control over regulation, planning, and interpretation. In this state, feedback is no longer filtered through a lens of fear, but interpreted through the circuitry of growth. Effective feedback loops are not purely external. One of the most overlooked components of a feedback-rich environment is the internal self-monitoring system. Developing the ability to assess your own performance through reflection, journaling, data tracking, or deliberate self-review activates brain regions like the anterior cingulate cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which are associated with metacognition. This self-awareness allows you to create micro-adjustments in real time rather than waiting for someone else to point out a mistake. The more skilled you become at internal feedback, the more autonomous your growth becomes. But this skill doesn't develop in isolation. It emerges from consistent exposure to high-quality external feedback that teaches the brain what to look for. Technology can also enhance feedback loops when used with precision. Wearables, biometrics, behavioral data, and performance tracking tools can offer immediate and objective feedback on things like focus, recovery, output, and progress. But the key is interpretation. Data without context is noise. To make feedback neurologically actionable, it must be embedded in narrative, what it means, how it connects to goals, and what adjustments to make next. This is why coaches, mentors, and accountability partners are so valuable. They don't just deliver feedback, they help you decode it, internalize it, and act on it. That decoding process is what ultimately wires the brain for better performance. Culture also plays a role. In environments where feedback is rare, emotional reactions to it tend to be intense, either defensive or self-critical. But in cultures where feedback is normalized, frequent, and reciprocal, the nervous system adapts to it as part of the learning ecosystem. This reduces the emotional load and increases the efficiency of learning. It becomes possible to separate identity from performance, recognizing that feedback is about behavior and choices, not about worth or personality. That separation is essential for sustained growth, especially in high-performance domains where the stakes and visibility are high. To build a feedback-rich environment requires commitment to transparency, accountability, and openness. It's not enough to wait for feedback to arrive. It must be actively sought, welcomed, and integrated. This means asking better questions: what worked, what didn't, what can be refined. It means creating systems for reflection, channels for honest communication, and rituals for review. Over time, this environment begins to reshape the individual. The brain becomes faster at learning, more resilient in the face of mistakes, and increasingly wired for adaptation. In such an ecosystem, growth is no longer dependent on willpower or luck. It becomes an inevitable consequence of design. Visualization is not merely a tool for relaxation or surface-level motivation. When practiced deliberately and with purpose, it becomes a profound lever for neurobiological change. The human brain is a prediction machine. It simulates future scenarios, anticipates outcomes, and adjusts behavior accordingly. What we visualize with intensity and precision can have nearly the same neural impact as direct experience. Purpose-driven visualization capitalizes on this mechanism, aligning mental imagery with deeply held goals and actions, shaping not just what we imagine, but how we perform and who we become in the process. At the core of visualization is the activation of neural circuits involved in motor planning, sensory perception, and emotional regulation. Functional MRI studies show that imagining a physical movement activates many of the same areas in the motor cortex as actually performing the movement. Visualizing a conversation, a speech, or a difficult decision triggers the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system in patterns that mirror real-world engagement. This is not just conceptual thinking, it is embodied rehearsal. The brain interprets vivid mental imagery as training. When done consistently, visualization strengthens the exact circuits needed to execute the imagined action in real life. Over time, this reduces performance anxiety, increases efficiency, and builds familiarity with success. However, not all visualization is effective. The brain is not equally responsive to vague daydreaming or unfocused optimism. Purpose-driven visualization differs because it is anchored in specificity, tied to intention, and embedded with emotion. It begins by defining a concrete goal, something you care about deeply, something that demands your full capacity. The imagery then becomes a rehearsal for that future reality. You see yourself engaging in the behaviors required to reach the goal, navigating setbacks, overcoming resistance, and embodying the mindset necessary for sustained effort. You don't just see the highlight reel, you simulate the full journey. This engages a much wider network of brain systems, including the anterior cingulate cortex for conflict resolution, the insula for interoception, and the hippocampus for contextual memory encoding. Purpose-driven visualization must include process as well as outcome. Simply imagining the end result, winning, finishing, achieving may feel good temporarily, but it doesn't translate into adaptive behavior. In fact, research shows that overuse of outcome-only visualization can reduce motivation as the brain gets a false sense of completion without the tension required for action. To make visualization neurologically effective, you must simulate the behaviors, the grind, the effort. You see yourself waking up early, focusing deeply, pushing through resistance, and recovering from failure. This prepares your nervous system for what real growth feels like. It installs familiarity with the difficult sensations that typically derail progress. You begin to normalize discomfort and in doing so, reduce the fear response when it arises in the real-world execution of the goal. Emotion amplifies this process. The more emotionally charged your visualization, the more durable its neural imprint. The amygdala and hippocampus work together to encode emotionally significant imagery with far greater strength than neutral information. This is why athletes, performers, and elite professionals often include not just what they will do, but how it will feel. The fear, the pressure, the exhilaration, the uncertainty. When you allow those emotions into your simulation and stay with them, regulate through them, and stay focused despite them, you create a kind of emotional conditioning. Your brain learns that intensity is not a threat. It learns to stay regulated, calm, and focused even as internal arousal increases. This skill, trained in visualization, transfers directly to moments of peak stress or performance. Purpose-driven visualization is also a tool for identity shift. When you repeatedly imagine yourself acting as the kind of person who achieves your goal, the brain begins to update its self-schema, the internal story it tells about who you are. This is not fantasy, it's the beginning of belief formation. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which integrates self-related processing and value encoding, begins to align more closely with the imagined version of yourself. The more frequently and vividly you practice this, the more natural it feels to behave in accordance with that image. This accelerates behavioral change because the internal resistance to acting differently is reduced. You no longer feel like an imposter attempting a new behavior. You feel like you're expressing a version of yourself you've already rehearsed. Integrating this kind of visualization into daily practice doesn't require hours. Just 5 to 10 minutes of focused, emotionally engaged mental rehearsal can significantly enhance motivation.